We will now move to Mr. Ahmad Khan, Vice President, Power Generation and Water, ABB India.
Okay. Good evening, ladies and gentlemen, and distinguished fellow panelists, and Mr. Sethi and Mr. Sen. It's an honor to be here. Very engaging discussions, and especially from Mr. Sen, the PGCIL perspective. Obviously, you run the country's grid, so it's a very insightful input. What I will be doing is to, spend some time talking from the generation side of it. Okay, so that's a little bit, not so much on the pure grid itself, but then from the generation, which is really the source from where we get all that we have to pump on the grid. So let's look, first of all, as Mr. Sethi said in the beginning, I mean, why do we do all this? It's for the consumer. Consumers is us. So it's for the consumers, and there are obviously, things which you see on this slide, but more than that, already covered about, the regional grids, microgrids, interconnected grids. All of this being led by a few drivers. And the drivers, I would say, if I look at India, for example, I mean, the amount of, the newer cities, the people who used to be living in small towns and villages now moving to the city, expecting a better quality of life. Even in the villages itself, as Mr. Sen said, I mean, the availability of power is no longer an expectation. That is a given. So that is where we are moving. So we have a whole lot of new consumers added to the system who are expecting like air and water, having an access to electricity. The other one, which of course also is consumer related, is on the, the environment side. And I think that's the second major driver, which, for all of us consumers as well, the environment is the other factor which is driving it. There is a whole lot of other things. We touched a little bit on the previous presentations in the topics like the technology is evolving, and by evolving, what it is making available to us is tools which allow us to make things more efficient. They allow us to make it cheaper, cost effective. So the efficiency goes up, the consumer gets passed on the lowest tariffs, So those are some of the broader trends which, which are really behind what is happening on the grid, the modernization of the grid. I mean, it's not just the modernization for the sake of keeping the existing infrastructure well maintained and running, but really also having newer reasons and drivers behind this modernization drive. So let's look, a little bit on, what it really means for us in terms of the broader drivers. I mean, one thing I can say is that tomorrow will not be a continuation of today. I mean, we are already living in a time where, things which did not exist 3 years ago are now part and parcel of our lives. So certainly tomorrow, even from the grid modernization and the power generation point of view, won't be a continuation of today. Not even remotely. Look at some of the things which are there on this slide. I mean, these are the data points captured from all over the world. They are not necessarily the Indian data, but then this is how the world is moving, and world is increasingly interconnected. So what happens in Germany today, let's say in some of the generation technologies, will be happening in India by another couple of years. So that's how interconnected we are. We talked about the renewable growth, the renewable penetration. This is where the world is headed. The Paris Agreement on climate change, it talks about limiting the temperature rise to less than 2 degrees centigrade. And if that's what we are headed for, in the long term, eventually, there won't be any coal-fired power plants. Because if we continue having coal-fired power plants, we will not meet that objective. And it's not, it's not completely unbelievable. When I was a child, I would travel to my, grandparents in a train often driven by steam locomotive. Today we don't see it. My son has never seen it. We'll probably, so this is where the world is headed. This has happened in certain segments, and this is where the, I would say, the power generation industry is headed. So the renewables is here to stay. But then the renewable, the solar and wind especially is highly variable, and that really puts demands not only on the the availability from the grid perspective, but also from the generation perspective. We just heard from Mr. Sen about 60% of India's generation is still thermal. Okay. I mean, that puts a lot of stress on these plants. Most of them were designed as base load plants with highly inflexible, supposed to be running on the, almost continuously all the time. And now we have the renewable coming into picture, which really, is forcing them to go more and more towards the, the flexibility, which I will talk about a bit later. The other areas which are really coming up, I mean, the business models, the things like energy storage. Just today I read that Germany, one of the mines has been converted into a massive storage area. I mean, I'm not surprised. We are going to have more and more of it. A whole lot of bright people around the world are working on how to make this technology available to us very soon in a commercially usable way. That's on the horizon. We already touched about the regulations, and I mean, I agree. I mean, in today's time, the regulation is really following the usage, but regulation is also one of the factors which is coming more and more. So these are some of the, I would say, drivers, but then what are the elements involved? We touched a little bit earlier about the grid interconnection part, storage, digitalization. I mean, a whole lot of our previous speakers have talked about big data. Sains have talked about big data and, 5Vs and 4As. And I mean, the digitalization, I mean, in the previous session, I was sitting on smart cities, and I mean, people are talking about data being the asset, the new asset. I mean, all of this is true. And really the data, the 0 and 1 form of, a whole lot of things around us, and the computing power that we have at our disposal, that's really driving. And I mean, for us in ABB, we call it the ABB Ability Platform, which really has the possibility to, convert a whole lot of zeros and one into tangible information and value for the end users. But more and more digitalization is the way forward. Power generation is going to be one of the elements of the evolving grid, and that's where I will spend next few minutes in the subsequent slides. Power quality we talked about, and then the business models. I mean, these days, business model is an area in itself. I mean, people are finding a whole lot of new ways of doing things which, which seemed just did not exist a few years ago. So, coming more to the, the power generation side, here I have captured, and really this slide is not, I can understand from the back side, not easy to read, and I will also not read it completely, but then there are certain trends and challenges which I wanted to capture here. We already touched a little bit on trend side. I mean, things like, the sustainability, the environmental aspect, the renewable being there, pricing, since I've also touched upon 15-minute and lower blocks being there on the market. But then on the challenges side, now I'm more in the next few slides specific to the power generation and the utilities. The utilities around the world are facing a few challenges which are common, and I think India is really not disconnected as so far I have seen the industry. I mean, the lack of visibility into the performance matrix. I mean, believe it or not, there's a whole lot of power plants where some things as simple as plant performance calculation is not implemented. I mean, it's not easy to compare the actual generation compared to the design data, because we are not capturing that information and converting it into, the reports which the people can see and act on. When it comes to investments, I mean, we also from the industry side, as also from the user side, the utilities themselves, the ROI justification for the improvement objectives. A lot of these things are not so tangible as to put a new transformer and the immediate ROI which comes with it. So that is one area where the challenge is. A whole lot of disparate systems. I mean, over the years, the power generation industry has a whole lot of different systems, and now when we talk about, data being the asset and data flow being the key driver, I mean, that itself becomes a challenge. One of the challenge the industry is facing. Yeah. And then, of course, there are a few others which probably is more a matter of time. I mean, things like collaborations within the departments of the utilities, and I mean, that I think is less of the issue. But then, going forward on, what do we do with some of these challenges? And automation, which is, let's say, nothing but software. I mean, in the automation is more software which acts on in a more defined set of inputs which are there from a power plant, the solar or thermal or wind or hydro, you know, and I think that has major kind of solution opportunity for a whole lot of challenges. To begin with, you know, as I mentioned earlier, once the renewable penetration crosses 20 to 30%, the flexibility demand on the existing thermal assets or the fossil assets goes up. Now, as I said, a lot of these plants are designed for base load operation, things like, you know, the minimum load that they can support, I mean, which used to be 40 to 60%. I mean, now we need to have 25 to 40% because the greater bandwidth you have, more renewable penetration can be supported, you know. The faster ramp up of the plant, you know, a lot of plants are in the, let's say, 1% per minute kind of range. We need to have in the range of 5 or 6% or even more. I mean, that's the kind of ramp up we need to have to for, I'm not talking about gas plants, which are typically higher ramp up. I'm talking about hard coal kind of plants. And then in terms of, you know, so these are some of the things which, you know, from the flexibility point of view are important. Automation has a lot of solution which comes, which fits here. Now, the other things are, you know, in terms of even simple components, like when you have a boiler, when you are going to operate at lower flames, lower loads, even the detection of flame becomes an increasingly important area. A lot of our plants in the country don't even have a very sophisticated flame monitoring implemented. They never needed it. So there's a whole lot of things which we have to look and get into this. From the ABB perspective, you know, the portfolio that we have with our Symphony Plus platform, which is, by the way, the last year was given the Smart Technology, Smart Grid, Smart Technology Award as well. I mean, we have a whole range of portfolio which in the country here is being, you know, the experience of implementing it in places like Germany and Denmark, and which are some of the more leading markets where the same things have happened, whether in the area of analytics or flexibility I talked about, ramp up, ramp down, and bandwidth. Some of those areas, predictive maintenance, that is one of the things we heard about the maintenance aspect. I mean, these are some of the things. Cyber security, we just touched on that. I mean, it's a hugely important area for utilities, hugely important, yeah. So these are some of the portfolio solutions that we have, and I really feel thankful to have this opportunity and really touch some of the aspects of grid modernization from the generation point of view. With that, I really come to the end of it. Thank you very much.